California's coastline is vanishing, not eroding over decades, not retreating over years. Vanishing. Right now, on February 27th, 2026, entire sections of California's most iconic sea cliffs are dropping into the Pacific Ocean in seconds, taking homes, highways, and everything built on top of them straight down into the churning water below. Scientists who have studied these formations for their entire careers are standing at the edge of collapse zones, staring at readings on their instruments and asking a question that should never have to be asked. How did this happen? February 27th, 2026, 5:43 in the morning Pacific Standard Time. A California Geological Survey monitoring station positioned along the bluff line north of Pacifica detects ground movement readings that immediately trigger automated emergency alerts across 3 separate monitoring networks. The numbers appearing on screens at the California Department of Conservation headquarters in Sacramento are not supposed to be possible. Engineers reviewing the data in real time reach for their phones before the analysis is even complete. By 5051, the first collapse occurs. A 240-foot section of coastal bluff north of Pacifica drops directly into the Pacific Ocean. Not gradually, not in stages. The entire formation goes at once. A single catastrophic failure that sends a wall of rock, soil, and saturated earth thundering into the water below in less than 4 seconds. The seismic signature registers on instruments as far away as Berkeley. And this is only the beginning, because by the time the sun rises fully over the California coast that morning, 3 more sections have gone, different locations, different geologies, and scientists are asking themselves a question that cuts to the core of everything they thought they understood about this coastline. What if this was never going to be slow? To understand what happened on February 27th, 2026, you have to go back, not years, decades. And then you have to understand something that most people living along the California coast were never told. The cliffs they built their homes on were never stable to begin with. Pacifica sits just 12 miles south of San Francisco. If you've driven down Highway 1, you've seen it on its layers. The sweeping beaches, the dramatic bluffs rising 60, 80, sometimes 100 feet above the waterline. The homes perched at their edges with unobstructed views of the Pacific. It looks permanent. It looks ancient. It looks like the kind of landscape that has existed for 10,000 years and will exist for 10,000 more. It is sand. Much of it is little more than compressed sand and ancient mud, described by the U.S. Geological Survey in their own documentation as firm in a few places. That qualifier, in a few places, should have been the headline. Instead, it was buried in technical reports that developers never read and planning committees never acted on. And by the 1960s, entire apartment complexes were going up right at the bluff edge, their foundations planted directly in material that the ocean was already in the process of reclaiming. There is a photograph taken in 2016 that captures what was already happening a full decade before the events of February 2026. It shows 3 apartment buildings on Esplanade Avenue in Pacifica. In the image, the front corners of the buildings are hanging over open air. There is no ground beneath them. The bluff has already retreated so far that the structures themselves are partially suspended. The residents were still living inside. The image was shared widely, attracted significant media attention, and then the news cycle moved on, RECL. Because nothing dramatic had happened yet. No one was hurt. The buildings were eventually condemned and demolished, and the cliff kept retreating. What no one fully communicated to the public, number one, what the scientists understood but struggled to convey in a way that registered as urgent, is that coastal cliff erosion does not work the way erosion sounds. The word itself implies something gradual, something you can watch and measure and plan around. An inch a year, a foot a year, a slow grinding retreat that gives you time. But cliffs don't erode the way rivers cut canyons. They store stress. They absorb wave energy, groundwater saturation, freeze-thaw cycles, and seismic vibration for years, sometimes decades, without showing any visible change whatsoever. And then, without warning, they fail. Not an inch at a time, all at once. A cliff averaging 1 foot of retreat per year might sit completely still for 20 years, and then, on one specific morning, a 20-foot section goes. In a single event, in seconds. Scientists at Scripps Institution of Oceanography had been documenting this pattern for years. The research was clear, the papers were published, the data was available to anyone who looked for it. The public thinks in averages, but cliffs fail in events. The average is almost meaningless without understanding the catastrophic episodes that produce it. And those episodes, by their nature, cannot be predicted with precision. They can, however, be anticipated, and the data that existed by early 2026 should have been sounding alarms at every level of government. The California coastline stretches 1,760 kilometers. Of those, USGS researchers had identified that between 24 and 75% of California's beaches could be completely eroded by end of century without intervention, craft, and that was a conservative projection, assuming manageable sea level rise. The more extreme scenarios, the ones scientists had assigned low probability but refused to dismiss entirely, pointed to numbers that reshaped entire coastal cities. Pacifica's own planning documents from 2018 projected sea level rise of 6 to 10 feet by 2100. Those projections were already being revised upward by 2025 because the processes driving them destabilization in Greenland and Antarctica were accelerating faster than the models had predicted. The numbers that had seemed like distant future problems were arriving early, and the monitoring data told a story that was increasingly difficult to interpret as anything other than imminent crisis. Between 2010 and 2020, certain 1-kilometer sections of the Pacifica Bluff Line had recorded average cliff retreat rates of 1-2 meters per year. That is nearly 4 feet annually, year over year, in a place with homes and roads and utilities built right to the edge. By 2023, after a series of exceptionally powerful El Niño plush-driven storm seasons, those rates had not stabilized. They had increased. The California Coastal Commission knew this. The California Department of Conservation knew this. Individual geologists who spent their careers on these bluffs knew this. In May 2025, the Coastal Commission had approved a controversial plan allowing Pacifica to reinforce its seawalls as a stopgap measure, explicitly described by the Commission's own executive director as a response to an existential threat. The word existential was used in an official Commission statement. The beaches, she said directly, would disappear without fundamental changes to how communities lived and built along the water. None of that language reached the people who needed to hear it most. The residents of the homes at the bluff edge, the families who had owned those properties for generations, the people who, on the morning of February 27, 2026, woke up at 5:43 to the sound of the ground beneath them disappearing. Here is what the monitoring data captured in the 12 hours before the first collapse. At 11:18 p.m. on February 26, a Pacific storm system that had been building for 6 days made landfall north of Fort Bragg, with wave heights significantly exceeding seasonal forecasts. The swell propagated south through the night, reaching the Pacifica coast in the early morning hours in combination with a tidal cycle that pushed water levels to their maximum seasonal height. The bluff system north of Pacifica had been continuously monitored since 2019 to a network of ground movement sensors installed as part of a joint USGS and California Geological Survey early warning project. At 5:43 a.m., those sensors began recording anomalous displacement readings at the base of a 240-foot cliff section, settle at first, the kind of micro-movement that precedes major failures. The automated alert system triggered immediately, generating notifications across 3 emergency management networks simultaneously. But there is a gap that matters enormously here. Between the automated alert triggering and a human response being coordinated, there is a window. Systems need to be verified. False positives happen. Protocol requires confirmation. On a Wednesday morning at 5:43 a.m., the engineers and geologists who needed to act on those alerts were being woken from sleep, deciphering their phones in the dark, trying to understand what they were looking at. They had 8 minutes. At 5:51 a.m., the ground moved. The cliff face, which had been absorbing wave strike for 6 uninterrupted hours at the maximum wave energy of the arriving storm swell, reached the failure threshold that the sensors had been measuring toward all morning. The separation began at the base arm. A sudden shear failure in the saturated clay and sand layer that formed the foundation of the bluff and propagated upward through the entire formation at a speed that no human observer could have tracked. 240 feet of coastal bluff, approximately 340 feet wide, weighing an estimated 1.8 million tons, dropped into the Pacific Ocean in 37 seconds. The seismic signature was later described by researchers at Berkeley Seismological Laboratory as indistinguishable, at initial recording, from a magnitude 2.4 earthquake. The sound was heard by residents in Pacifica and as far north as Daly City. The wave created by the material entering the water damaged a section of Highway 1 that ran within 200 feet of the collapse point, and somewhere within the debris field now churning in the Pacific were the remains of two structures. at 1. A private residence that had been condemned and emptied 6 weeks earlier. 1. A section of coastal trail infrastructure that had been closed to visitors since January. No one died in the first collapse. That fact, in the hours that followed, would be described by emergency managers as fortunate. It would not hold through the day. At 7:14 a.m., a second collapse occurred. This one, 1 mile south, along a section of bluff that had not been flagged as high priority in any active monitoring report. A section measuring approximately 180 feet of cliff face detached and entered the ocean in a failure that lasted less than 2 seconds. The material that went into the water included a portion of a private road that served 8 residential properties. It also included the front half of a garage that had been attached to a home sold 14 months earlier for $124 million. The owners were not home. They were, by the particular grace of circumstance, visiting family in Sacramento. At 8:02 a.m., the governor declared a state of emergency for coastal San Mateo County. By 8:15, FEMA had been formally notified. By 8:30, aerial survey teams were airborne along the entire stretch of San Mateo coast between Daly City and Half Moon Bay. What they found from the air, transmitted back to emergency operations centers in real time, upgraded the situation from a serious incident to something that emergency managers struggled to find adequate language for. The bluff system was not failing at 2 points. It was showing active instability indicators at more than 40 locations across a stretch of coastline spanning nearly 11 miles. The storm swell that had arrived overnight was still driving wave strike against the base of the formation. The tide had not yet turned, and the saturated condition of the soil above the bluff line, MAT, the product of a winter that had delivered 180% of normal precipitation in just the previous 6 weeks, MAT, meant that every section flagged as unstable from the air was carrying significantly more weight than the underlying geology was rated to support. Dr. Ellen Park, a USGS coastal geomorphologist who was among the first scientists to reach the collapse site on foot that morning, later described standing at the edge of the first failure zone and looking north and south along the bluff line. She said she had studied this coastline for 11 years. She had published papers on its erosion patterns. She had testified before the state legislature about the risk levels embedded in the current development footprint. And standing there that morning, looking at what the sensors were showing and what her own eyes were seeing, she experienced something she described as a professional reckoning. The models, she said, had been right about the trajectory. They had been wrong about the speed. The third collapse happened at 9:47 a.m. This one was different, not in its geology and not in its mechanics, but in what it took with it. A section of Esplanade Avenue, on the same road that had appeared in photographs in 2016 with apartment buildings hanging over the edge, failed along a 90-foot stretch that included active utility, infrastructure, a water main, 2 buried electrical conduits, and a section of fiber cable serving approximately 1,200 residential addresses. The material entered the ocean. The utilities separated. And for the first time in the sequence of events on February 27th, people were directly in proximity to the failure. A maintenance crew, Point Red, 3 workers RAND, had arrived at the site at 9:30 a.m. to assess the condition of the infrastructure after the earlier collapses. They had parked their truck on Esplanade Avenue and were on foot along the bluff edge when the sensors in that section began their final acceleration. The automated alert had triggered 11 minutes earlier. The evacuation order for that section had been issued, but the workers were already on site, already in the field, and in the 8 minutes between alert and failure, the communications chain that should have reached them directly did not reach them in time. 2 of the 3 workers were far enough from the failure point to reach the road. 1 was not. He fell 63 feet into the debris zone at the cliff base. He survived. He was airlifted to San Francisco General Hospital with injuries that were serious but not life-threatening. His name was not released to the public at his family's request. By 11 a.m., the entire stretch of coastal bluff between Daly City and Half Moon Bay had been placed under mandatory evacuation for all structures within 200 feet of the bluff edge. Highway 1 was closed in both directions through San Mateo County. And the fourth collapse of the day, a 160-foot section just north of Lindamar State Beach, Bonn, occurred at 11:23 a.m., with no one in proximity and no structures directly affected. The storm swell peaked at 1,900 magents, measured in the days that followed, covered 3.7 acres of California coastline that no longer existed. In the aftermath, the questions began. They came from residents and officials and journalists, and they all converged on the same central point. Why didn't anyone know this was coming? The answer to that question is more complicated than the outrage it generated, and more troubling. Because the honest answer is, people did know. Not the specific date, not the specific sections, not the hour and the minute. No monitoring system and no predictive model in the world can provide that level of resolution for coastal cliff failure. But the conditions that produced February 27, 2026 had been documented, published, warned about, and in some cases, argued for urgently in policy hearings that found reasons to delay action. The Scripps Cliff erosion research had identified erosion hotspots along the entire California coastline and explicitly noted the pattern of sudden, catastrophic failure events on warning against interpreting average erosion rates as predictors of incremental change. USGS projections had put between 24 and 75% of California's beaches in the complete erosion zone by end of century. The same year those projections were published, a proposed $700 million cut to the Coastal Resiliency Fund (R&D), the primary state mechanism for monitoring, reinforcement, and managed retreat programs, MOD, had moved through the budget process. The California Coastal Commission, under enormous political pressure from property owners and development interests, had approved the stopgap seawall plan for Pacifica in May 2025, explicitly framing it as temporary while acknowledging the inadequacy of the long-term planning position. Environmental groups had warned that armoring the shoreline was delaying the reckoning while making it worse. Seawalls deflect wave energy downward, accelerating erosion at the base of the cliff rather than eliminating it. The science on this was not contested. The decision to approve the seawalls was made anyway, and now the engineers who had installed the monitoring network north of Pacifica were releasing internal timeline documentation showing that the sensor alerts on February 27th had been accurate, had been timely, and had reached the correct people, but that the emergency response chain had not been engineered to operate at the speed the sensor data demanded. 8 minutes from alert to failure. That was not enough time for the existing protocol. The protocol had been designed, as most emergency protocols are, around human decision-making timelines rather than geological ones. What February 27, 2026 revealed is not a failure of science. The science had been correct. What it revealed is a failure of translation. The systematic inability of complex, probabilistic, long-horizon risk to generate the kind of political and social urgency that immediate, visible threats produce almost automatically. A hurricane generates urgency. A cliff face that has been quietly retreating for 70 years, punctuated by sudden catastrophic events that are locally dramatic but quickly forgotten, does not. Dr. Park, interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle 3 days after the collapses, put it in terms that cut through everything else. She said the California coastline had been giving every signal that was scientifically possible to give. The monitoring data was real. The erosion rates were documented. The failure patterns were understood. What she and her colleagues had not found a way to communicate, she said, was the feeling, the visceral, undeniable physical reality, of standing at the edge of a bluff that is not going to be there next winter, and understanding what that means for everything built on top of it. That feeling, she said, was now available. The collapses on February 27th had not been the worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario would have involved failure events during peak daylight hours, with the Highway 1 shoulder occupied by vehicles, with the bluff edge trail systems full of pedestrians, with no advance warning from the monitoring network at all. The fact that the day's events produce one serious injury rather than dozens of fatalities was the product of early morning timing, recent structure condemnations that had cleared several buildings, and a monitoring network that had done exactly what it was designed to do. The question that scientists and emergency managers were now asking, urgently, without any of the hedging that had characterized the conversation before February 27th, why was whether the existing framework was remotely adequate for what the data was projecting would come next. The answer, based on every model and every dataset available, was unambiguous. It was not. There are currently 1,762 kilometers of California coastline. Of those, hundreds of kilometers sit in the active erosion and failure zone, bluff systems carrying decades of accumulated stress, saturated from above by record precipitation, undercut from below by wave energy intensifying with each degree of ocean warming. The monitoring network that functioned on February 27th covers approximately 14% of the highest risk sections. The remaining 86% is either monitored at lower resolution through older technology or not systematically monitored at all. The managed retreat programs, the deliberate, planned withdrawal of structures and infrastructure from the highest risk zones that coastal scientists had been advocating for since the early 2010s, had been approved in principle and funded at approximately 23% of the level that the Coastal Commission's own technical staff identified as minimally necessary. And the communities that sit on the remaining bluff line are it. The cities and towns and neighborhoods where families have lived for generations, where property values are tied to the views and the proximity to the water, where the political economy of coastal development has always made it easier to approve a seawall than to mandate a retreat. Those communities are now watching what happened north of Pacifica and asking themselves a question that has no comfortable answer. How much time do we have? The answer that the data provides is not years, it is winters. The sequence of conditions that converged on February 27th. A powerful storm swell, maximum tidal height, 180% of normal seasonal precipitation in the previous 6 weeks. A geological system at accumulated stress from decades of accelerating erosion is not an anomaly that will take another generation to repeat. It is a pattern that climate projections suggest will become more frequent with each passing season, not less. The cliff does not erode like a river cuts a canyon. It holds, and holds, and holds, until the morning it doesn't. And when it goes in seconds. The California coastline held for a long time. February 27th, 2026 was the morning it started going.